Welcome to Unlearn, where we talk to industry leaders about unlearning how we go to market.
I'm Kelly Sarabin, and I run Tech Partner Enablement and Advocacy at HubSpot.
And I'm Asher Matthew, co-founder of Partnership Leaders.
The old ways of going to market are getting more expensive and less effective.
To thrive in an era of digital transformation, you have to go to market differently. Let's find out how. All right, Chris, tell us a little bit about yourself that we don't already know, and then we'll introduce ourselves to you.
Hey everyone, I'm Chris Walker. I've been a I've labeled myself as a marketing professional over the past 10 years since I got out of college, where I studied biomedical engineering. But what I really was doing was understanding business. I think I was spending a lot of time in operations and product development and marketing, and now I've probably sold $30 or $35 million worth of deals in my career. And so I've basically been working across the whole business. And now I think I have a really interesting perspective when it comes back to how the marketing function is operated today, understanding it at, I think, one of the deepest levels of a professional out there, and consulting with more than 200 companies over the past 3 years. So seeing a lot of that stuff and then translating that to my view as a CEO of the size of a company that many of our customers are, 100 to 500 employee people, and how you should structure your organization, how you should set your KPIs between your quote unquote marketing and sales team, whether just dividing it between marketing and sales, the way that we've always done it, is even the right way to do it anymore, or whether we should challenge how we structure our organization to be successful. And so I think my perspective, both in the depths of marketing and now as my vantage point as a CEO, is very unique.
Cool. Well, this podcast, we're calling it Unlearn. And Kelly and I were talking about what do we need to do to grow in this, let's say, even more highly volatile times than we've all experienced before. And, as people grow older, which I am doing now, I'm thinking hey, there's a few things we got to just unlearn, and then create some mental space to learn some new concepts. And so I thought, okay, it'll be a great way to interview some guests, or just have not even interview, but just have a quick conversation about hey, here is the quick concepts that I think that we should unlearn, and then have a quick discussion about them, and then keep this uber high quality, and see if we can drive some change in people's lives. So that was my perspective on this podcast. But Kelly, what do you think?
Yeah, I think following digital transformation, there's been a lot of adjustments to how businesses want to buy, and the sort of direct marketing and sales playbooks have really not caught up with that transformation. So we're sitting in this very interesting point, and I think data and attribution has a lot to do with it as well. If you don't already follow Chris Walker on LinkedIn, please do. He puts out a ton of good content on this.
You're definitely living under a digital rock if you don't follow him, right?
I don't know, though. So we come from partnerships and ecosystems. And one of the things Ash and I talk about a lot is marketing, sales, partnerships. You get these echo chambers, and people really aren't going over to the other side. And I think that touches with what you were just saying, Chris, about marketing and sales, and do we have this structured properly? But for people who aren't familiar with your work, I'd love if you can give the sort of high level overview of your position that demand generation is broken and dead, and we need a better framework. If you could just kind of explain that point of view, I think that would be really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Get me back on that if I forget it. But there was one point that was mentioned that I just kind of want to cover here. Yeah. I find it absolutely fascinating that companies never challenge how we're going to be effective at driving revenue until things are going wrong. Like, the time to figure out your podcast, you're having positive ROI on your paid social media spend, cutting out all the garbage lead generation programs that don't drive revenue and are wasting money for years at a time, and making some of those decisions in 2019 when it would be a total offensive move and you could have capitalized like many businesses did over that time by doing things differently. But don't question it until the economy tanks and you get forced to do it in 2022. I think those are really interesting perspectives that business leaders should consider. People only look at the marketing function when things are going wrong. They don't treat it like an offensive function. And so I think there's just and then when you get into this time where demand is falling for every category, where companies are having layoffs, where stocks are crashing across tech and SaaS, where valuations are declining. In these volatile times, the way that you drive growth is through your product strategy and your business model, not by trying to figure out your revenue system. You're fighting against the dynamics of the market. Demand is declining, and you're trying to build it from the ground up, and it's just going to you're going to struggle to make it work. So figuring those things out before the economy declines, so that you can maintain your revenue, so that you can retain customers and things like that. And then when it happens, then you think about, what do our customers need differently today? How could we change our product quickly to adapt to this climate? How could we innovate on our business model to set us up to be highly differentiated to capitalize right now? And asking those questions in April of 2020 versus we don't know how to create demand. What are we going to do? I think that's how I think as a CEO. Now, when you think about the state of how demand gen is operated at companies, I just believe that the function is highly misunderstood. I believe that some people, when they hear demand gen, they think running A/B tests. I think that some people think it's outbound cold calling. I think that some people think that all you do is just generate leads. But generally, I think the function is misunderstood. And when you look at, it's not about the definition of the function, it's look at how it's implemented in practice. I've spent time working at more than 200 companies, and I see how their quote unquote demand gen function gets implemented in practice. And it's effectively a sales support function. It is generating leads or other types of signals like MQAs to trigger their SDR team or perhaps their AA team to do outbound sales to people that didn't ask to talk to them. And what you need in that function, what you need in a holistic revenue system, is you need high levels of autonomy. You need to be focused on revenue, not an intermediate metric to revenue, to actually be effectiveness oriented. You need to be looking at things in the next, for now and in the next 12 months. You need to have a short time frame, and you need to be customer centric. And so those are the things that you need. And then when you look at how companies structure their demand gen organization, that it's based on efficiency. How do we hit a cost per lead number or a cost per meeting number, not how do we find the right things to drive revenue in the future? It's an internal focus to support sales. It's not focused on customers. The controls put in place by software-based attribution, high levels of lead target KPIs, other constraints in the business make this not an autonomous function and prevents innovation. And for all of these reasons about how the company sets it up, what you need out of that function versus how it's implemented in companies doesn't make any sense. And so what I've suggested to companies, many companies already do this, is they take the sales operational support for sales functions, intent data, ABM, SDR outbound, lead generation, and just put that under a chief revenue officer, under your sales team. It's an efficiency function to support that sales function. But then you have this huge void in your revenue team. And the way that you solve it is by creating a holistic view of all revenue programs. Marketing or demand gen is just looking at their programs, and sales is just looking at their programs, and the brand team's just looking at their programs. People hope that revenue operations would be able to do this, but I'd be happy to explain why they're not able to. And we need a function to look at the entire revenue system, evaluate all the programs in a standardized way to prevent the marketing team from changing the MQL score to get more MQLs at the end of the quarter, or by changing the attribution model to make SEO look better than what it's doing, or all the other things that marketers do to game metrics to make their programs look better to executives. And what we actually need in our entire business is we need to look at it all in the same way. And we need to have an independent function to help to evaluate programs, to decide which ones to kill, to experiment on new things, decide what experiments we run, and decide how to reallocate investments to drive growth over the next 12 months. And so that's why I believe that companies that are winning will do what I just said, move parts of their demand gen function under sales and build a revenue R&D function. And then you have a revenue R&D team and you have a revenue team, not a marketing and sales team. People want this to be one team, but it's actually it's two separate teams that report to the CEO that serve very distinct, different functions. So that's how I think companies will operate. That's what we've done at my business as of a couple of weeks ago, and look forward to paving the way.
It's interesting because sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, I was
just going to say, like, I say the same thing in partnerships too, and I'm like, just focus on revenue, right? And then I get vilified for making these, like, statements that are offensive sometimes, right? And but I agree 1,000%. As somebody who's done both partnerships and been a CRO, there's no other way to actually pave the future outside of what I call a full stack revenue professional. And it's interesting because product has this, right? You have people that are proficient in both, like, front end and back end product. You have engineers that are proficient in front end and back end engineering, right? Why aren't there revenue professionals that are proficient in all these concepts? It's not that hard, but it does require focus. Kelly?
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, I think that was the idea behind the chief customer officer, right? You see a chief customer officer
Oh man, we went to
supposed to
titles.
oversee all of these revenue driving departments and functions and make sure that they're looking at the whole picture. And I think product-led growth has actually pushed companies more towards seeing the end-to-end journey. But I'd like to know more, Chris, about how this would be structured in this newer model, because you're essentially saying a lot of that optimization, that demand generation, which, by the way, I just want to call out that, like, demand generation is the highest paid marketer other than executives. So companies clearly see value in it, even if they're misguided and poorly executing on it. It's something and maybe part of the reason they're always looking for the talent and trying to pay more is because they're not getting what they think they should be getting from it. But in this new model, you're saying they would have a closer affinity with what is now called sales.
No, which has
Not
always
necessarily.
been called sales.
What's that?
It has always been called sales.
Not necessarily. So first point, yeah, the demand gen person might be the highest paid of any marketer, but they're still way less paid than a sales professional. And so I'll put that out there, and how much the world has changed since the sales and marketing comp bands have been reevaluated. It's been 20 years. I also think that we should be reevaluating whether a variable 50-50 or 70-30 type of comp plan for sales professionals is appropriate anymore. The reality is that in the year 2000, the sales professional did the marketing, the prospecting, the selling, and the account management. If they didn't go out and get business, they weren't going to hit their quota and they weren't going to make money. And the reality in companies today is that there's plenty of parts of the company that create demand for customers: customer success, word of mouth, marketing, the CEO evangelizing the category. There's plenty of things that capture the demand. Google SEO, your website, your partner network, the sales team directly, your SDR cadences. And there's plenty of ways to convert demand: product-led growth, and sales assisted or enterprise sales motion. And so the reality is that the dynamics between how you actually drive revenue today are fundamentally different, but we haven't adjusted comp plans to match that. I think it's a huge flaw in companies. I also think that variable commission plans allow companies to overplan and make irresponsible decisions. Then when they inappropriately plan and they don't have enough demand and there's 47% of their sales team hits quota, the sales people lose the money, the company recoups the money, and the company just fires them. And I think it creates a lot of the wrong behaviors in venture funding companies, and why we're seeing a lot of challenges in the sales department overall, I think, is based on outdated variable commission plans. But anyway, to get a little bit further on this, I think that a really good way to highlight this is how companies have traditionally thought about how to think about attribution and scoring and reporting and shit like that, where they just say it either came through marketing, sales, or partner, and then we'll just apply 100% credit to whatever captured the demand on a like tipping point or last touch attribution model. And I think it's entirely flawed, because the reality is that all of those departments and partners, in addition to other areas of the company like customer success, like your executive team, things like that, are actually all contributing to those outcomes by creating demand, capturing demand, and converting demand. And so I'm suggesting that companies look at it a different way, which we're calling pipeline sources. So instead of being department focused, it's based on the buyer. Where did the buyer convert, and how much can we infer about their intent based on where they converted into a sales conversation? And you have major buckets: partner, your website, ABM intent data driven outbound, cold outbound, events, You don't have that, pure lead gen. You don't have that many other buckets. So you basically break it up into these 6 things that are agnostic to the department. And then you say, what are the best ways where our customers are coming through? Where do we have the highest sales velocity? Where are we getting the most sales productivity? What are the things that are driving huge inefficiencies? Maybe we should just cut cold outbound and stop doing it. Look at how much worse the pipeline velocity is than our inbound and our ABM motion. And so I think that companies looking at it that way strips out the emotion of departments and creates the data to operate an all-bound model, but actually have the underlying insights to understand how to drive the strategy forward. All-bound is great in theory. Yeah, we want buyers to convert however we want, but we need to be able to look at data and make decisions off of it. So I'm just providing a framework for people to use to make the decisions, which isolates where are we capturing the demand, which is a surrogate to buyer intent. And then we have a whole nother element, which is how do we create the demand? And we have a whole nother element of what is the best way to convert the demand. And so by breaking it out into, I think, these key functions, and by looking at it as a pipeline source rather than what department sourced it, you're going to create a lot more alignment in your business. I think the sales marketing credit fight that I had going on in 2017 that still exists at many companies is just so dumb, for lack of a better word. And so I think and this provides an entirely just a different way to look at it that solves all the core challenges. And basically all that I've done throughout the 3.5 years that I've run this company is I consult with tons of smart, talented companies and executives. I see what the problems are in their business that they're communicating to me. I synthesize patterns of what am I hearing over and over. I can then use my brain to deduce why is this happening because of my vantage point. So now it's not only this is what's wrong, but I can explain to you why it's wrong. And then because I really understand how the engine works and why things are going on, I can present very non-obvious, new, different solutions to solving these problems. And so I think that the logic and process of how I've gone about innovating at what my company does and trying to innovate for the overall revenue professional, that's how I do it.
No, it makes sense. And I know we didn't do intros at the beginning of this because this is a conversation. So we'll introduce ourselves as we go through the convo, right? But in my day job, I actually am one of the go-to-market execs at Demandbase, right? And so we did this panel, or maybe call it a huddle, maybe that's the better way to say it, right? With about 19 or so CMOs, right? And we just counted the different ways people count, right? Or the different ways people go to market, if you want to call it that, right? And so it was sales-led, marketing-led, customer-led, product-led, partner-led, community-led. And those are the 6, I would say, 6 different ways to count this thing. And so then I asked,
successful companies do all of those.
I do. So I said, is there one dashboard that you can grab this from? And they were like, no, we don't have it.
We crushed a community. We crushed marketing. We crushed sales. We haven't done partner yet. We are building a product led. Good, strong companies do all of these. I think that it really does it. I just think it does a disservice to all of us as professionals to try and say that one is leading all the other. Yep. The reality is that if you just had partner and none of the other things, over time you're going to be vulnerable. Agreed. If you just go product led and you don't have an enterprise sales team and you don't have an ecosystem, over time you're going to be vulnerable to people. And so I think the idea of having one function led as a go-to-market strategy makes no sense because you should be doing all of them.
Yeah, I think I'm with you. Maybe the led word is too strong. Just like the word hate is definitely too strong in companies when they're talking about attribution, right? But maybe driven is the right word. But I agree with you. The go-to-market has to be treated as a mode, right? Because companies treat product as a mode, and I'm I think it's cool. But in the future, sorry,
I don't think product led is a moat.
I know, but sometimes people say that, right? And I'm I don't think that's actually true.
I agree with
most people that say that, their companies go out of business, basically. Sorry, Kelly, go ahead. I don't want that to hog.
No, I agree. I think that ties back to your setting up things for competition. If you use product-led growth, you're sort of putting it as a frame that product's the most important function in the company, and I think that's goes back to these multi-attribution models where you get these turf wars not between just marketing and sales, but we see that a lot in partnerships, right? Partnerships, people are saying, we drove 15% or 20% of the company's revenue. And even framing it that way starts to lead to these turf wars where you're trying to make sure that your partner got more attachment than the marketing lead. But I think there's another sort of theme in your work, and you kind of just mentioned this, that's interesting, was the difference between demand creation and demand capture. And I think that's really worth diving into, because in general, I would say companies are not as good at demand creation, and it kind of requires a different mindset, maybe a different time frame, and it certainly doesn't fit nicely into that lead obsessed model where you're asking yourself, next month, how many leads have I got on my form? If that's your view, you're probably not doing a great job creating demand. But yeah, I don't know if you want to unpack that a little bit more.
Some person, by the way, listening to this podcast just lost their Ferrari, because they're like, I can't even like handle this anymore.
I mean, like, what does everyone think happens before someone goes to Google? Do they just one day they have this like brilliant idea and they're like, oh my gosh, I got to go in there and search financial business software. That's what I'm going to do today. That is not how it works. There are ongoing triggers that happen that can activate a buying process inside of mainly places that companies don't execute because they don't measure effectively. And so the way that I look at this, and many people, and this is not unique, many people look at it this way now, is instead of looking at it as a funnel, we look at it in two stages. The company's either in market or they're not in market. They're either showing intent to buy or they're not showing intent to buy. And we need two different strategies for those two different people. The one that are showing intent to buy have already if they're in there searching financial business software,
yep.
They've most likely seen that pain point in their business. They heard about it from a colleague or a friend. They saw a post about it from a CEO on LinkedIn. They listened to it on a podcast that isn't your company's podcast, but it sounded interesting, so they're going to go and check it out. And something created the demand where they learn about it when they're not looking for it, which then drives them at some point as a trigger to say, okay, now I'm going to go and market and I'm going to go explore whether this is right for me or not. And it's very common for a company to go and then demand created. They go in market, they decide not to buy, they don't even engage with vendors, they go back out, they're like, oh, it's going to be $30,000 a month, let's just go back. Now they're back here, they're not in market, all of a sudden another trigger, their CMO leaves, now they're back in market, they're looking, then they just evaluate 3 vendors, no decision, they go back, they're not in market, 6 months later they don't hit their plan, now they're back in market and they choose one of the 3 vendors that they already looked at. And so this idea that you buy in a linear process and once you get to proposal, you won't go backwards, I think is so outdated and so dumb. And in order to operate in that way, you must have 2 distinct motions. You must have a core motion for people that are showing intent. They do those in a couple of core places. It's not complicated. They're going to go and search within Google. They're going to go to your website if they already know about you. They're going to go to affiliates or other programs like that, like G2. They're going to go into dark social and ask their peers and other people what they think about your company. They might eventually land on your website. And if they're doing that stuff, your job is to figure out if you have an enterprise sales motion, how to get them into a sales conversation. And if you have product-led, how to get them into your product. But then you have this whole bucket of the market, which I estimate, people say 95. I actually think it's greater than 99% of most markets that are not in an active buying cycle right now. And they might have been 6 months ago and now they're not anymore. And you need to have a motion to be constantly creating demand for your category in the market to your entire total addressable market or your super consumers, whatever you decide. Super consumers, top 8 to 10% of your TAM. And so you got to have a motion to be actively creating demand by educating those people. Now let's get into why companies don't do this. It seems so logical, right? Like, we should be marketing to people that don't want to buy, not asking them for a sales conversation because they don't want to buy right now. We should be doing marketing and sales in a different way to educate them, which then pulls them into the things that are interesting about what we can do for them.
So right before you launch into that part, because I feel like a meaty chunk of this podcast is coming. So you called it Revenue R&D, right? And it's actually phenomenal, right? Because there was another meetup that we did with about like 90 or so CMOs at like this demand. And but by the way, this podcast is not demand basis podcast, right? It's like Kelly's eyes venture into doing something. But what you just said happened in actually another one of these sessions that we had, where they actually started talking about we need to actually treat this whole process like a product, because product teams have this thing down where they just iterate like every 2 weeks or every week and a half, like whatever their teams are comfortable with. And it's not that, like, I know there's Scrum where there is a full-blown framework where you can like iterate every 2 weeks and stuff, but if your team doesn't want to iterate every 2 weeks, they just want to iterate every 3 weeks, let them iterate every 3 weeks, right? But it's the getting the mindset into that mode where we're going to launch it, make it better, relaunch, and we're just always launching in a way, right? And so is that how you're thinking about it, Revenue R&D, or like how do I like internalize this?
So the way that you're communicating and suggesting, I think, is way too micro, and we should be looking at this more in the macro. So like, sure, sprints could be an effective tactic, but we need to zoom out and look at it at a higher level. There's a couple of key things that I want to hit on here. The first one is how companies justify their investments in product development. What do? They get customer insights. Yep. They decide how we're going to act on those insights. They put together a business case. They get it approved to go through and do it, and then they work through a development process about how to build it. And they then, when knowing that the first month they build it, they're going to spend $80,000 on engineers, and they're not going to generate any revenue. And that's going to happen for 3, 6, 9, 12 months for big features. And they know that they're doing it because the ROI in the future will pay back the cost of the development. Yep. That's how they do product development. Now, what happens when you do it for revenue programs? Day one, you decide to launch your podcast, you decide to run a Google ad. Day one, where's the ROI? This is in working dollars. It's being scrutinized against the results that we generate this month, and it kills and destroys innovation. 100 flat out, 100%. Companies can't innovate because of the way that they look at the ROI. If you did this in a different way, and you use the Revenue R&D framework, go out, get customer insights. Damn, what we're finding out is that all of our customers are finding out about how to do this type of technology from these 3 key people. These 3 key people are speaking at conferences, they're talking on podcasts, and they're doing things like that. Let's put together a monthly roundtable with these 3 people where we bring them on and we do a live event, and it happens once a month, and that becomes a podcast and video content and things like that. And that will be the experiment. And it's going to cost us, in the sponsorships and everything like that, it'll cost us $25,000 a month. So after 6 months, we've invested $150,000. And maybe in month 0, $0 in pipeline. Month 2, $0 in pipeline. Month 3, $100K attributed to the podcast. Month 4, $200K attributed to our LinkedIn promotion of that. Month 5, $300. Month 6, $400. So all of a sudden, you've done 6 months of work. You've seen increasing results. You've spent $150,000, and you've generated $1 million in pipeline, where if you use a standardized definition of pipeline, you'll know that you're going to win at least 25% of that, or $250,000. And then all of a sudden you can say, wow, we just spent $150,000 and it's only been 6 months and we're already at a positive ROI. Our product never does that.
Yeah, I think this is great.
Yeah, so I think that people really need to start changing, and that's why it's split between a revenue R&D team and a revenue team. And so active programs are being run across all different departments of the organization, and these experimentation things are then running.
So this is an incubation team inside of the revenue team. Okay, this is super interesting because, Kelly, when we had our good friend Balls on the Partner Ops webinar, he also talked about an incubation team within the partnerships team to work on new business models, which, going back to the beginning of this call, this podcast, Chris just said, like, hey, one of the things where you're gonna win is just flipping the business model.
Yeah, I think one part of it is incubation, but I think there are other principles of this process that are strictly important, which is creating a standardized measurement and attribution model that you use across your entire business, by having one function, Revenue R&D, evaluate the effectiveness of all programs of the organization, and in a holistic way and standardized way. So this is not just like we're going to go out and do arts and crafts and some experiments. It's really like this is the command center that drives our future go-to-market based on the strategy that our product strategy and CEO and product people have delivered to us.
Are we going through the revenue R&D process right now? Are you running that process on us? Is that what's happening?
We're
not his target customer.
But
I'm not offended by it. I'm just like, oh, wait, I just had a Matrix moment, you know?
we have built our organization exactly how I'm telling people right now. We use a revenue R&D framework. We've standardized measurement in our business as well as more than 50 B2B SaaS companies. So we have a really good sense of like people call it pipeline across all their different things. They say stage 2 pipeline is what we're optimizing for. And then on their cold outbound, they win that pipeline at 7%. In their partners, they win it at 60%. In their website, they win it at 40%. And in the model, everything is weighted the same. It makes no sense. Pipeline should be standardized based on a win rate metric that's aligned to revenue. The way companies align it based on the stage of their sales process, I think, is highly outdated. And it flaws a lot of the analytics that come along with it that come out of AI tools and revenue intelligence tools and things like that by not looking and accounting for that metric.
Okay, but this is a separate team though, right?
100%.
Yeah, it is a separate team, right?
Let me talk through this because this is confused. Yeah. This is deep. So I believe that the overall function of marketing is not serving companies anymore, and they should consider reevaluating it. At the beginning, it was just product strategy, product marketing, brand, customer insights, strategic long-term work. And then in the last 10 years, it's become, there's a lot of short-term stuff. Lead gen or demand gen has come into marketing, which is short range. Marketing ops and data and technology, which is efficiency. And you just have all of these, you have this bucket of stuff called marketing that all has competing priorities between long range and short range, high controls or autonomous, effectiveness versus efficiency, and customer focus versus internal focus. And it's just a big mess. And I don't think that it's serving companies anymore to do it. In addition, the conflict between marketing and sales is undeniable. And companies try and put Band-Aids on it by hiring a CRO to align the function or do other stuff like that. And I believe that the real issue is that the marketing function should be divided into three core functions. That you should have one function that's focused on long range and doing what's right for the company in the long range. That includes product strategy, category strategy, product marketing, customer insights, stuff like that. I believe that the company should take the marketing ops and data out of that function and centralize it to a revenue operations function, which is focused on internal efficiency. And that they should roll the demand gen function that right now is mostly sales support. So take the things out of demand gen that are sales operational support, put that under sales, and then you have this void in your revenue team that you deploy revenue R&D in, which is a holistic view of all our revenue programs using standardized measurement data to build a pipeline of innovation, both things that we're running right now and things that we're going to develop in the future. Just because we're evaluating the programs in revenue R&D doesn't mean that we need to execute all of them. Yep, and so if the CEO wants to do a podcast or the brand team wants to host events, that's awesome. And those investments will be scrutinized in a standardized way in a centralized function. And so I work with enough companies, and companies have tried to have RevOps do a lot of these activities. And the reality is that there's this massive competing priority of RevOps between being internally focused on efficiency and being focused on customers and being effective. And it's just two polar opposites in the spectrum of the organization. And so over time, efficiency will always prevail, which is what's happening in RevOps, which should be just data and tools. And then all of these key things, how are we going to structure our attribution? How are we going to measure pipeline? How are we going to forecast and plan? How are we going to decide where to allocate investments? How are we going to decide what programs to kill and which ones to allocate more money to? And that happens in a revenue R&D function now.
So I want to dig in a little bit more on the attribution, because I think, to your point, that is one of the biggest blockers that companies are afraid to change from their current attribution models. And honestly, either they don't know how to do it or they think it's not precise enough. So in this newer model, I think you could have those forms to customers, right? Like, where did you hear about us? You can also do these more detailed customer insights and interviews across the entire stage, right? Is there additional ways that you are able to attribute some of these demand creation activities?
So first off, I just want to like sort of communicate a distinct difference here is what I'm saying is that most companies should effectively transform their demand gen function into a revenue R&D function and structure the organization and the responsibilities and the KPIs to support that objective. And so what I'm communicating here is that I put myself in the category of demand gen from 2015 to 2022. And what I've found is that the constraints that hold the demand gen community and professionals back are deeply rooted and are never going to change. And so when you think about what's going wrong in your organization, it's like they think that the only way to measure things is with software because they're only optimizing for demand capture and driving leads. And there's these old, outdated behaviors about how the demand gen function worked in 2016 that still perpetuate in companies right now. And so
this is pretty innovative, actually.
Well, so I'm saying someone wants to adopt your model, right? They're like, yes, you're right. Things are broken. That sounds good. I'm saying, are the ways that I was talking about, asking the customer, how did you find us? Doing those detailed customer interviews. Are there additional ways that you can understand where, was it the podcast? Was it the fact that you went in these 5 Slack communities and you were a vocal presence there? What we often refer to as dark social, all these different ways that, to your point, isn't yet trackable by this very specific software and dashboards. What do you advise your companies to do in order to get the clearest picture possible as to where they're excelling in creating demand?
The major breakthrough on this one is deciding that we need to measure demand creation and demand capture differently. Right now, companies just try and jam it into, we have a demand capture tool, let's try and measure demand creation and demand capture with it, and naturally it doesn't work. So you need 2 separate measurement mechanisms.
It's the way that people feel this, by the way, and I've felt it a number of times, right? Is there's a moment that happens when the entire company starts to become a marketer and a CMO, and they just tell marketing everything that they want to do. And I think this actually solves for that, because if there isn't a revenue R&D function that's sitting outside of marketing, then when people get this feeling around, hey, now sales is telling me how to do marketing, or product is telling me how to do marketing, or the CFO just told me how to do marketing, right? And you're like, fantastic, you want to do this? Go ahead, launch it. You're going to get scrutinized the same way that everybody else is, but we're just going to put it in this bucket so that it actually gets done, so you feel like you were supported, versus us just having to queue this up and just never getting to it because of the way we measure things. I think this is brilliant.
Or just put self-reported attribution on your form that drives all your revenue through your website, and push that into a Slack channel with the entire company. And we do that at our company, and it's very clear. A lot of submissions in high ICP say, I love your podcast. I've been listening to your podcast for 2 years. I've listened to every episode. I see Chris on LinkedIn. I saw your CEO on TikTok. This exact person referred us business. We know all of these things that companies just decide not to measure, and it drives our entire strategy forward. And so I think that right now, with the available information, that it's like the easiest thing to do is put that field on your form and be able to understand in a free text environment, not a drop down and shit like that, to understand how people are discovering your company. And what they tell you is they tell you what created the demand. Very few people in there are saying, I found you in Google search. They tell you what created the demand, and then you have attribution software in place, which is perfectly appropriate to measure what captured the demand and dictate pipeline sources and things like that. And so you have all of the information that you need. So I think just that would be a massive leap forward for most B2B organizations, because you're literally going to get a bunch of stuff that you didn't know was working, or you thought was working but couldn't prove it, and now you can prove it. The next thing is that to separate the idea of a program versus the activities that support the program. And so like my live events, I'm not scrutinizing my live events against revenue. My live events are a way to create the podcast, which then drives revenue through the podcast and LinkedIn. And so I'm not over here saying wondering whether my event strategy is working or not, because we drive 7 million or more in pipeline a quarter from our podcast, and the event feeds into the podcast. And then lastly, I think that if you did separate the functions this way and you did have a long range effectiveness function called product and category strategy, that you should be doing in-depth customer research, qualitative and quantitative at various market sizes to understand how to shape, dominate, and educate your category. And so those are, I think that using large-scale market research surveys as a way to understand people's buying preferences would be very eye-opening to companies. I did it in 2017. Most people still haven't done it today. I did it in 2017 and it changed my career forever. What did people say? I don't want to talk to your sales rep until I know the price. Where I do learn about these things initially is through social media and podcasts and people that I trust. Before I talk to your sales team, I want to talk to someone that's used your product before. And when you just ask your customer what they want to accomplish and how they want to buy, it dramatically would change how your company goes to market. But most companies go to market, they sit in a boardroom and they say, what's going to be easiest for us with the resources that we have right now? And they don't think about whether they need the 12-person outbound team to cold call people. They just try and say, okay, since outbound's not working, let's make our 12 junior people that can't help an executive at our target customer and make them content creators instead of starting with a blank slate and just thinking critically about what buyers need today.
Playbook market fit is what I call that. You go in, they're like, we have 500 companies. Which playbook worked for which segment? Oh, SMB in APAC. Let's do this. Totally. Yes. I totally agree. And actually, what you're saying makes so much sense. Again, when COVID hit, and I was part of this other bootstrap company, we actually literally shut down all marketing. We literally just had a podcast. And then we created a sales funnel around the podcast. And we had no idea what we were doing, but we just knew that people really wanted to chat with us about our problems, but they wanted to chat with us not in a discovery call, but in a live environment because it was fun. And we would hit people up at 4 p.m. or 5 p.m. and people would say, well, that's insane. And we're like, why? Every executive is free at 4:15 or 5 o'clock. And because you can't really go out about, they're just going to pick up the call. And then you're like, hey, here's a rolling podcast right now. Let's go. And it worked beautifully. It actually became one of the top podcasts in B2B after 200 or 300 episodes, which I guess you need that type of volume anyways, right? So, but yeah, I mean, I would say this works. If you just go and look at it as a, I mean, you're calling it R&D, but I would just call it you look at your go-to-market as a product. Yeah, you are going to actually like discover new things and new ways to like speak and be very, very close to your customers.
Yeah. And then just to highlight something, and this is like at an executive level, I think that most executives just fundamentally misunderstand how to create, capture, and convert demand today and still operate on old principles where salespeople did all three of them. And so when they think about planning for next year and how they're going to get to their revenue goal, they just say, how much revenue do we need? Let's do a reverse headcount model. How many reps do we need? How long are they going to onboard? Things like that. And they don't understand that it's highly inefficient and ultra expensive to have your sales rep creating demand today. It makes no sense. And then they don't invest. And then because of the attribution skewing and measurement mindsets and things like that, they invest all their marketing dollars in capturing demand. And they have no engine and no investment and no way to measure anything that they do in creating demand. And the entire system is super inefficient. You got too many salespeople at the bottom waiting for demand that hasn't been created yet, and you just burn money. People miss quota and things like that. This is a very basic systems engineering approach. We have a system. The dynamics of the system are changing. We need to adjust the system to adapt to the changes. And so just looking at them as three separate things and doing I really view it as basic process optimization and looking at where's the gap in our go-to-market. And it's almost always the companies are over-invested in sales to convert demand, and they don't effectively invest or measure how and go out to create demand. And that's the issue.
I agree. I think the key there is that market research, and by now people like McKinsey have put this out, right? That people prefer to go and spend like 5% with a vendor AE, 5% of their buyer journey. But so many companies have just not caught up with that in terms of how they go to market. Do you think the macroeconomic conditions are going to be good for this business model, or do you think because of the time component, it's actually not going to help because people are going to be short-sighted?
For my business model?
Not for your business personally, but for sort of spreading this throughout the market, right? Because we have this conversation in partnerships all the time, because partnerships actually faces a lot of the same problems. There's a lot of partner influence that isn't necessarily captured in all organizations in a very similar way. And so some organizations have responded by saying, just drive revenue by being a reseller, or get out. We're going to cut the program. Now, other programs are more mature and they already have influence being recognized, and I think those are going to be able to continue on and flourish. But I'm curious if you think, the economy sort of becoming more challenging in general is going to make people less likely to sort of see the light on this and change how they're operating, or the opposite?
I think that if companies practice this mindset in April, it probably would have been effective. I think that transitioning and adopting it now might be a little challenging. But the reality is that the way that you adopt Revenue R&D is the first thing that you do is you standardize measurement across all your programs, and you do a holistic analysis of how all of your different go-to-market programs are working based on how you measure stuff today, not how you're going to measure it in the future. And what would you find immediately when you did that? Because I've done this on more than 100 companies. I literally am inside of their Salesforce data, looking at how much they spend, getting their budgets from finance, looking at what's going on. And you can immediately find 20 to 80% of the variable program spend on marketing and SDRs is totally wasted. And so companies want to save money right now. The first thing you should do is scrutinize your programs, not just say, we're going to cut marketing by 30%, scrutinize the whole go-to-market and decide what are the places that actually should be cut. And when you do that, you're going to find a couple of things. You're going to say, here's one big bucket of stuff. We know that we can measure it effectively, and we know that it's not working based on that data. Let's cut it. Then you're going to have another bucket that you say, we can measure it effectively, and we know that it's working. Great. Then you're going to have a third bucket that you say, we think that it's working, but we can't measure it effectively. Now we have to go out and decide, can we close the gap on measurement to know whether this stuff is working or not? Then you have 3 buckets of spend. Then you take all the stuff that you were wasting that wasn't working, and you apply that money to either get it back to the company because times are tough. But probably a smarter thing would be, how do we go and take this money and deploy it to the stuff that's working right now that we know is driving revenue? It would be a much better investment than keeping 6 more of your sales headcount on your 200-person sales team. But companies just don't look at it that way. They just say, let's cut marketing because it's the easiest. And then you deploy all those funds. Then you probably have some left over, 20%. I think at this point, most companies should give that back to their organization. If you want to be innovative, then I would put that toward experimentation and building out a true revenue R&D function inside your organization, which is going to provide as significant of a competitive advantage as having the best developers and product teams. It's going to be the same thing. There's such exact parallels, and I speak with such conviction because it's already over. Companies they've already decided that they're going to do this in other functions. It works so much better than how the revenue team operates. Why wouldn't you move a similar but adapted mindset and framework from your product team? In your business, you really only have 2 things. You got product and go to market. Those are the 2 things that differentiate and win for companies, and you typically need both of them. Obviously, there's culture and there's other things too. I'm simplifying here, but those are the 2 major things. And you have all this stuff that's working to build your product effectively. Why wouldn't you put some similar wrapping around it? Because most often companies have a great product and they suck at go-to-market. It's rare when you have it the other way around.
Well, it would be awesome if the company had 4 co-founders and they were all CROs, then it'll be solved for it. I'm just kidding. That company's not going anywhere. They're going to fight over attribution. I want to be respectful to Chris this time because of the nature of this podcast is unlearning, right? And so we're going to ask people a ton of questions, and I'm sure some of our guests are going to get very annoyed with us, but the greater community is going to learn,
Let's do it.
Chris, I want to get 2 minutes of your feedback on the Revenue R&D, just looking a little bit more at just partnerships holistically, because Kelly and I are on this journey together. Some partner god somewhere was happy at us and said, go do this. So we're doing it. So what are your thoughts on just the Revenue R&D, but a little bit more focused on the partnership side of the business?
So when you look at partnerships, we consider that a program inside of the Revenue R&D framework, just like marketing your category through podcast events and LinkedIn would be. So it would be tracked as a program, a key program inside of the revenue R&D model. And then you would move it through the stages based on attributable results. Sure, you're going to have direct sales from partners, right? That's often the only way that it gets attributed. If you installed self-reported attribution and you have partners that actually create demand, that will show up in self-reported attribution. And so that could be another way to measure it. And I think those are really the clean-cut ways. When I love installing self-reported attribution and doing it for companies, because within 2 weeks, you know what's working and what's not, just based on what customers tell you. And so you get a lot of interesting insights where if you do have if something's working, you know immediately. And so if partners are out there doing things that are unconventional, that are creating a lot of demand, I find partners to be a lot of demand catchers.
Yep.
Basically, the company has to, and it's the same with distribution of hardware and other partner models. Like the company has to go out and create the demand, and then the partner just captures the demand for someone that already wants to buy. Hey, we need HubSpot. We need someone to implement it. Let's go to this company. And so if you have to decide what your partner network is, most often I would call it capturing demand, and therefore they should probably be scrutinized against how much demand that gets captured. But it's not like I look at it differently than the idea that like our partners captured 1.1 million and our sales team captured 1.9. Like I guess our sales team's better. Like I don't really look at it that way. They're all separate go-to-market motions that contribute to the overall strategy. Yep. Yes, you should be investing appropriately in each one based on what you think are the best investments for your company, and hopefully you have some data to support it. But it's not really a competition. It's more of like, where do buyers go when they want to buy? Maybe you're seeing a pattern. If you've been measuring this over time, maybe you're seeing a pattern where your direct sales are going way up, or vice versa. Your partner channel is going way up and outpacing your direct stuff. And that type of insight on those trends would be really useful to drive future strategy.
Cool. All right, Kelly, one last question from you, and then I have one question for Chris, and then I feel like most people cannot stand a podcast that's more than 18 minutes because there's just too many concepts, but this was so good I just kind of let it go, and maybe we'll just cut it up and like share it over a couple of weeks ago or so. But like, what's one last question from you, and then I have one thought for Chris.
One last question. Okay, if someone's a CMO inside an organization and they're bought into what you're saying, what would you say would be the most effective argument to the rest of the C-suite in terms of turning this leaf?
I think that most CMOs will be resistant to this because
they see the logic of what you're saying.
Yeah, I'll explain both sides, but I like to proactively address people's concerns because I can imagine what people are thinking. Most CMOs won't want to do this. What I'm saying is we're going to take your big bucket of marketing and we're actually going to break it up, and we're going to put you in the place where you do the best work and drive the best value to the business. Often for a CMO, that falls into product strategy, customer insights, product marketing, and demand gen plays second fiddle, and they don't know anything about ops. And so we're sort of like breaking that up and putting distinct functional leaders in charge of that and creating visibility from the CEO to these functions at a level that's needed to drive the strategy forward. And so it would involve having marketing get broken up between revenue R&D, which would be a functional leader at the same, it doesn't have to be a C-level title, but it would be it would sit counterpart to the chief revenue officer. You'd have most likely your CMO that would take over leading the product strategy and category strategy work. And then you'd put the ops inside of RevOps. And so that's the overall design, and that's the rationale for why most CMOs wouldn't want to do it, because they would feel like they're getting they would lose responsibility, not that they're making a choice that's going to put them in their strength zone and make the organization far more effective. But if a CMO wanted to go down this path, I think that sort of pulling out a couple of the key points that I've mentioned here, I think the biggest eye-opening one for me as a engineer and a scientist and understanding things very logically is that the way that we have marketing bucketed today sets it up for failure. Most CMOs don't stay for more than 18 months. The reason is because we have heavily competing short-term and long-term priorities that really deserve to be in two separate things. And if we made that choice for a CMO, the CMO could do all of the big long-term, customer-focused, strategic work that they love to do that drives so much value to the business, and not be required to hit a pipeline target this quarter, which gets in the way of all the important stuff, and someone else has to own that piece. And I think that when presented that way, it makes a ton more sense. It's going to create far better alignment between quote unquote a revenue R&D function and a revenue function are going to get far more alignment than a marketing function and a sales function in the way that it's set today. Many of our best, most successful customers, the CRO is actually leading the relationship, not the CMO here. When you think about revenue R&D and pairing with the sales leader, it's not like you're doing sales, but your counterpart to the sales, kind of like how the CMO is right now, but is split in different ways. And so I think thinking logically about that point is really interesting. And then I think that the organizations need to make a decision about how they want to measure and evaluate the success of their go-to-market. If they think the way that it's been done so far in this sort of like demand capture, sales focused type of thing, if they think that that's what's going to propel them to growth in the future, then they should keep doing what they're doing. Salesforce and Oracle and big, companies that are further along will keep doing that stuff. But damn, if you're 100 to 1,000 employees and you're trying to break into a new category or create your own category or go out and do something huge, you got to think different sometimes. You got to challenge what people have done sometimes. You have to look at everyone else is doing this and everyone in our VC portfolio is doing it, but is it right for us? What do our customers think? What are we going to do to pave the way that's different? I challenge revenue professionals to think that way because it's become very homogenous. People are basically trying to figure out how not to get fired, basically trying to figure out how to hedge with research from Gartner or other big firms that are respected, put it in a deck and say, we did our due diligence. What Gartner said to do was the right thing to do. So that's what we're going to do. I hope for people to be far more thoughtful and far more innovative in how they think about their revenue functions, because it just makes it way more fun. It literally, like, I have so much fun doing this stuff, sharing my thoughts with you, doing podcasts, meeting a bunch of people, seeing positive things from customers every time instead of, oh, I fucking hate your PDF on an ebook. I can't read it on my iPhone. And some of those things that people do, or why are you cold calling me 3 times? I just downloaded one of your pieces of content, and just the difference in how your customers respond when you do things that are in their best interest, which also drive good results for you, versus things that directly compete with what your customers want. It's just way more fun.
Well, thanks, Chris. We just lost Gartner as a sponsor for this podcast. Just kidding. Well, we gained Slack, No, I'll say, like jokes apart. This was fantastic. I mean, I think it landed on what we were trying to do with this series of this episode. I guess before closing this thing out, we'd love to have you back whenever you think is the right time. But are there other people that now that you have a feel for like what we're trying to do with this podcast, like are there other people that you think like we should bring on? Maybe if like there's a couple other people that are like, hey, you should get these 2 people because they will actually help other people unlearn some of the things that they've learned and then look at things in a little bit of a new way.
Yeah. So a lot of the foundational concepts between effectiveness and efficiency and autonomy and control and long range versus short range are concepts that were created by this guy, Lex Sisney. He runs a company called Organizational Physics, and it's been very enlightening to me to understand the way that he thinks, his concepts. And I think that it would help a lot of other executives and CEOs as well. And he challenges a lot of the stuff. We sort of took his foundation and took it a step further about what it means to the marketing function. But he challenges a lot of things that even dumb things that we did when we were 50 people that we look back on and we're like, that didn't work. And he's like, here's exactly why it didn't work. It breaks the rules. And so I think that you should consider having him on. I think it'd be really helpful to for executives to understand how the structure of the business in combination with the processes that you put in place create a lot of leverage, and how companies typically do a C-level 5-person leadership team and then roll a bunch of competing functions inside of those C-level leaders, sets C-level leaders up to fail, and it doesn't put the company in the best position to win. I get that it's a different view and it's non-traditional, but it's something that I've really embraced, and I think a lot of smart people would see it too.
Is there anything that Kelly and I can do to help you?
Just having this podcast was great. Great interviewers. I talked about a lot of stuff. Appreciate you inviting me. Would love to do it again in maybe Q2 of next year.
Yeah, it would be good to get some feedback. But Kelly, anything from your side?
No, thank you for coming on. You put out awesome content, and I think your perspective is just so useful here. So thank you for taking the time out of your day to share it.
Amazing.
Super.
Thanks for having me, everyone.
Thanks, folks. See you next time. Bye.
Thank you for listening to Unlearn. Subscribe wherever you listen and visit unlearnpodcast.com for the transcripts.